So good afternoon to those in the UK, good morning to any attendees in America, and a warm welcome back to this quarterly Japan Society webinar, hosted jointly with Asia Society Tokyo, and therefore good evening to everyone joining from Japan. I am Bill Emmett, and I have the honor of chairing the Japan Society. Thank you to all of you for your support for the Society. As our regular attendees know, every quarter in these Japan Macro Salons, I am joined by our good friend Jesper Koll, well known as a Japan Optimist, but also for more than 3 decades, one of the highest rated economists and strategists in Japan. Jesper has worked with the best, including JP Morgan and Merrill Lynch, and is now an expert director at the Monex Group, as well as a board director at the Okinawa Institute for Science and Technology. And of course, he is an advisor to us all. Now, it is not often, I have to say, during an international football tournament that England fans feel better than German ones, especially after penalty shootouts. So I'm very grateful for Jesper for still being willing to join us after the past few days' events. But actually, the biggest events of the past few days have, of course, been the elections in both the UK and France. And the biggest event in the UK for Japan watchers in the past month was the state visit by Emperor Naruhito and Empress Masako, for which the Japan Society was honored to co-host a reception for the Emperor, which I hope some of you managed to attend. But our task today is not to discuss European football, elections, or ceremonials, but to focus on the Japanese economy and markets. For that important purpose, let me also introduce our special guest, who will join us at about 12:15. He is Mitsunobu Koshiba, an extremely experienced and distinguished executive who spent his career at what was then known as Japan Synthetic Rubber Company, now JSR, of which he served as president from 2009 and then chairman from 2019 to 21. Now, Koshiba-san has founded his own think tank, CDoS, serves as an outside director of several companies, including in the semiconductor field, is deeply involved in government councils on advanced technology and startups, and runs the Committee on Economic Security and Advanced Technology at the Keizai Doyukai, the Japan Association of Corporate Executives. I look forward very much to the discussion that Jesper and I will have with Koshiba-san about all those issues, especially economic security and progress in the semiconductor industry. But first of all, as usual, I want to begin by reviewing recent economic trends with you, Jesper. Throughout the webinar, all attendees, please should feel free to submit questions at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and to vote for others' questions to bring them more quickly to my attention. Now, Jesper, I note that, of course, wage growth remains strong, but consumption is weak, thanks to wages having been still outrun by price inflation. I note, of course, the weakness of the yen, now 200 to the pound and 160 to the dollar. But I also note a very encouraging indicator that some attendees might think macabre: bankruptcy rates. Yeah. I got most excited recently when I saw a chart showing business closures on the rise, while at the same time corporate births are rising too. This is probably a good moment to reveal that Jesper is going to come to the British Isles shortly to appear in Edinburgh at the Fringe Festival on August the 20th to 25th at the Adam Smith House, on the subject of Japan, capitalism that works. Is this a sign of bankruptcies that capitalism is working properly? Should I be cheered by the rise in the corporate death rate, Jesper?
No, it's you put your finger, on the key development in Japan, which is that the corporate metabolism, finally has come out of its slumber. And really, metabolism is really a whole variety of things. The first one, of course, is business investment. And if you want to be bullish on Japan, look, we are now entering our 3rd year of business investment expenditure here at home, here in Japan, running at a rate of above 100 trillion yen. In fact, the latest Tankan survey confirmed that for 2024, for the current financial year, again, business investment expenditure is going to rise by almost double-digit. So, for the first time consistently in over literally, one generation, in over 3 decades, you've got domestic capital formation investing in more productive capital here in Japan, rising. And that shows you that, corporate leaders are under pressure to actually create new growth opportunities, and they do view Japan as a great opportunity. And it's very interesting, Bill, that this is actually very broad-based in the sense of that it's not just the semiconductor and technology industries, but you actually find that the small and medium-sized companies, the service sector companies, it's very broad-based, this newfound, let's put our balance sheet to work, let's invest in the future. You also see in this corporate metabolism, number one, business investment, number two, M&A activity, mergers and acquisitions here in the Japanese islands, running again for the third year at a record level. And again, it's very broad-based. You've got some small and medium-sized companies, but also some large corporations. And again, it's not outward investment, but it's happening here in Japan. And when you look at the surveys, why M&A is conducted, you actually find that the number one reason now is the labor shortage. So that you find in the small and medium-sized company space, sort of old enemies, right, that have been in the trucking business or in the logistics business or in the construction business, family businesses that have competed for the last 2 or 3 decades. Finally, they are actually merging because they are actually realizing, that the war for talent is something that's very structural. And that gets me to the third point, Bill, on what really is a new development, that wasn't quite there in the data when we spoke the last time 3 months ago, which is that wage growth is actually happening. You do find that labor mobility is picking up very nicely. Again, in the last quarter, you had listed companies hiring more people mid-career than they hired at the graduate intake on the 1st of April. And that tells you that the corporate metabolism, is actually coming up. And Bill, it's very interesting. When you look at the data, you actually find that of the people switching jobs mid-career in Japan, you find that the average increase in pay that induces them to switch is about 12%. So it's quite interesting, that actually now that there is a labor shortage, now that corporate leaders are indeed beginning to invest in productive capital as well as human capital, that actually the Japanese people, even the people in their 30s and 40s, they are actually price sensitive. So if you do offer a better pay package by about 12%, then you can actually hire that engineer or that sales manager. And that's very, very exciting that the overall metabolism in corporate Japan is now beginning to spill over into the labor market, into the market for human capital. And that makes me very, very confident, that this, recovery, is actually going to be sustained. And in my personal opinion, the one thing that, is that we all need to debate more carefully is a revision up in Japan's potential growth rate. Because if you've got capital formation rising and you've got labor mobility increasing, that does increase the probability that productivity growth is going to be accelerating. So the bottom line is you've got the Bank of Japan, you've got the IMF arguing that the potential growth rate is around 0.7, 0.8%. That's probably wrong. In my books, it's more likely to be around 1.5 to 2%. And it's that metabolism that tells the story of future productivity growth.
And that is fascinating. That would be a dramatic change in the potential growth rate. But I mean, if you really got that metabolism change, then that could happen. And what it would require is a big loss of those unproductive companies, and the growth of the productive ones. I mean, it's always been the long tail of unproductive companies that have held down that potential growth rate, isn't it? And do you, on the negative side, do you see that happening? That those, thanks to the labor shortage, they can't, they can't get.
So I'm with you. The most bullish chart is the reality that finally, after literally 20 years of declining bankruptcy rates, bankruptcies are now increasing. Now, it's still relatively small. You've got about 3.6 million incorporated enterprises in Japan, and bankruptcies are currently running, at around 1,000 to 1,200 per month, which is more than double of where we were this time last year. So there's a nice inflection that is actually coming through. Interestingly, Prime Minister Kishida has actually extended the support in terms of loan guarantee and preferential lending to small and medium-sized companies that was expiring or was due to expire over the summer of this year, but that has been extended by another 6 months. So of course there's some nervousness within the LDP, right? That indeed, the cost push inflation from rising input prices, cost push inflation from the war for talent, from people actually beginning to leave, that is going to put some of the key constituents for the LDP, the small and medium-sized companies, at risk. So as a result of that, that financial socialism, government intervention, is sort of the last bastion. The private economy is putting the pressures for bankruptcies to rise, but the LDP is trying to keep cushioning it, by keeping the zombie companies on life support.
Right. So we did, yes. So we hope that they fail, therefore. I mean, in other words, we really want that to come through. But do you see interest rates? What do you see as the Bank of Japan, just before we move on? What do you see as the Bank of Japan's attitude? Because in a way, if we come back to the yen, see, the big issue is one of the big issues is the interest rate differential with the Fed. What's going to happen at the Japanese end of that seesaw?
It is so interesting, Bill, because I just, 3 weeks ago, had a big fight with some senior people at the Bank of Japan. And I think, dear Sensei, as we all refer to for the governor, dear Sensei, I am afraid you are now behind the curve. I think the evidence of, cost push inflation having given way to demand pull inflation, right? I think the evidence is starting to be very, very strong and very, very powerful. And, as a result of that, yes, it was probably the right decision to start cautiously, basically after almost 30 years, give or take, of zero interest rates and massive intervention in debt markets by the Bank of Japan. It was obviously right for the first year of Governor Ueda's reign to be very cautious and taking very cautious steps. But now I think the risk of the Bank of Japan being behind the curve is very significant. And let me just put things a little bit into perspective, right? If you apply a Taylor rule type calculation, right? So where is a neutral policy rate? And by the way, former Governor Kuroda, right, as well as Ueda in private conversations, I mean, what would be, sort of a theoretical, what's a good rule to have as a monetary policy guideline, right? And they all agree that the Taylor rule, give or take, sort of gets you into the right figure. Anyway, if you do a Taylor rule calculation, neutral would be somewhere between 2 and 2.5% on the short interest rates. Now we are at 0.1%. So you're a long way away. And, it's quite interesting, that obviously the exchange rate is the adjustment valve. And the Ministry of Finance just a couple of weeks ago, basically wasted almost 9 trillion yen, 1.5% of GDP, right, in currency market intervention that made all my friends who are macro speculators extremely happy. Because of course, if you just intervene in the currency market without a change in the fundamental monetary or fiscal parameters, then you're just burning money. So it's quite interesting. And I think that, Governor Ueda slowly but surely is starting to come under pressure, particularly with some of the LDP people putting a lot of pressure on him, because clearly the big people hurt by the inflation are the Japanese pensioners. Because Japanese pensions, as you know, are technically indexed to inflation. But of course, the government under Abe put in something called the macro slide, which means that basically the pension increase, the payout increase, actually lags the current CPI increase. So if the CPI is around 2, your pensions increase by only about 1.5, 1.6. And so, of course, if you are one of the 4 Japanese who lives off a pension, right now this is terrible, because whether the Nikkei is at 50,000, whether the Shunto is at 5% or at 7%, doesn't make any difference, because your pensioners' purchasing power in real terms is actually going down. And by the way, in terms of policy initiatives, it will be very interesting to see whether Prime Minister Kishida, in this run-up to the LDP presidential election, whether he's actually going to promise to do away with the macro slide, so that actually pensioners get at least a fully indexed, inflation-adjusted increase rather than a discount to the current inflation rate.
Fascinating. Now, let me bring in Koshiba-san. If you could kindly turn on your camera, Koshiba-san, and if our brilliant, there we are. Here we are. So welcome to the Japan Society.
Thank you.
San. Just to repeat, a long career at JSR, distinguished career, very much a technology man and a materials engineer. How do you see, let's start with the metabolism that Jesper has been identifying in corporate Japan, in the lifeblood of the Japanese economy. How do you see that as a businessman?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you first. Thank you for kind introduction, and thank you for invitation to this show. So speaking of metabolism, certainly that Japan is pretty much in the midst of getting an excellent opportunity to revive Japan. Certainly in the short term for the corporate, this weekend is going to help us to, get some return, right? So short term, this is a good news, but also at the same time, the long term, like investing overseas is a kind of a little bit difficult, decision for any Japanese corporation to do. I think really, big firms, they are enjoying the current, economic environment. But, certainly that startups, which I'm pretty much helping, we have pretty much a little difficult time to, maneuver the current, economic environment right now. So I'm pretty much hoping that, this metabolism should happen. But, certainly that, still the politicians, LDPs, and they are so much, they're not really, popular, because of the money, politics issue. So they kind of tend to do a little bit of populistic, political measures, which may delay this metabolism. I hope that's not going to happen.
Now, Jesper has just prompted me that we should talk, since you've mentioned overseas investment. I'll hand over to you, Jesper, about that.
No, I think, Koshiba-san, your point about the widening gap between the large and the small is a very, very important point. But as you know, the Nippon Steel has made a very bold plan to acquire a company called American Steel. Now we all know that there is a political kerfuffle going on about this, but your personal opinion, on this, do you think the deal will go through?
No, I don't think so.
So you think that the American, geostrategic and political issues explain a little bit your thinking?
Yeah, I think really that if they had known a little bit more about the geopolitics and also long-term cycle of the geopolitics, they could have made a little different decision. They should have waited until election's over. So whoever get to be a president, anyway, there will be a lot of pushbacks, eventually. But I think, they're better off, if they wait until election is over.
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, although it was a long time in a way ahead of the election, America is in a permanent election, so you're always during during the pre-election period, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you could imagine when President Whitmer takes office, coming from Michigan, or President Shapiro from Pennsylvania. I guess steel will be an important part of their background, of course.
Exactly.
Of course, we'll mention Mr. Trump in just with a slightly quieter voice, but what he would do.
I don't know.
And how much, I mean, perhaps we should move on a little onto the general
Sure.
this area of economic security that you've been so involved with, since really geopolitics, this issue of overseas investment is, this is one aspect of it. Japan's passed its Economic Security Promotion Act, 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago. It was to be a phased-in process over 2 years to allow companies to get comfortable with it and to shape the detailed implementation of it. How do you think that's going? And from the point of view of particularly of companies, and what difference is it making to corporate decisions?
Sure. I think, first of all, I'd like to mention why we need this economic security promotion law in Japan. I do think in the light of a long-time cycle of geopolitics, I think in a global economy, global society, we are at the time of the war. The war is fought in 3 different ways: military, economy, and technology. So it is a kind of logical choice for Kishida's administration to increase his defense budget to the 2% of GDP. But of course, any military conflicts are the last thing any government wants to do. So therefore, the war is being fought by weaponizing economy and technology. So therefore, we want to grow our own economy to counteract any economic coercions coming from unfriendly countries. So this is why it's called Economic Security Promotion Law. So as you mentioned, the new form of capitalism led by Kishida, he wants to revive Japan as a technology and a science nation. This economic security law is designed to support his initiative. However, many corporate leaders misunderstand the spirit of this law and think they are more regulatory rather than the ones that would assist your economic growth. So as a matter of fact, those who understand the law well are taking advantage of handsome subsidies to assist the future growth and build the business resilience. So I think, it may take a little time for corporate leaders to understand what you meant by, economic security promotion law.
Well, I think that's natural, as you say, if especially where it diverges from direct regulation, when obviously that companies just have to adapt to that. But is it? I mean, I guess with the yen at 170 to the dollar, that makes the idea of promoting domestic technology seem at least temporarily attractive, although not necessarily for the investment cycle of something. Of a major thing like a a semiconductor fab or something like that. Has that made it all more palatable for Japanese executives? The fact that the yen is weak and therefore building these at home seems more attractive compared with buying Nippon steel, buying US steel, I mean.
Yeah, I think certainly that we kind of look in a short term, long term, right? In a short term, I think in a Japanese corporation, they are kind of short of money spending here in Japan to to give some business resilience, like how you can make an investment of domestic production capacity, something like that. So this is a wonderful opportunity for Japan to Japanese corporation to, add or recover some resilience, here in Japan. And I think, Japanese market has some momentum. So therefore, something like semiconductors, certainly, Japan is investing a lot of money to revive a semiconductor supply chain. So those, those are who involved in semiconductor business, they are pretty much enjoying the current environment right now. But also at the same time, I really don't think that this Japanese yen, weak Japanese yen, certainly that this is something to do with difference between federal interest rates, but also at the same time, Japanese corporation. If I were the business leaders, I'm making the business, the profit of overseas. I just retain the profit overseas. I would not convert, those kind of revenue into yen. So, just because I just want to reserve the money in dollars or euros, so that we can really invest, again in the overseas. So really that's another pressure that the yen is going to keep, remain weak. So therefore, I think, being a being a Japanese business leaders, certainly we just, make money overseas, just reinvest the money into overseas. That's how you can really, invest in the, invest for the future. So, certainly that we look at the short-term growth, but also at the same time, we should really, be mindful about future growth of the company, even though that yen will remain weak in the future.
Yes, but how sustainable is that? Do you see the semiconductor investments that are going on? I mean, the Nikkei Asia this morning had a story seeming to feature that the main benefit was the increased sales of fine wine in local department stores in Kumamoto to TSMC executives.
I mean, it's very interesting because it's obviously easy to make sort of little jokes about this, but that's what regional economic development does.
Yes,
and I mean, the reality that you've had, even though highly subsidized by the government, you had a major technology factory creating, what is it, give or take 6,000 jobs, in the region, of which, by the way, more than 10% had to be filled by foreign workers, coming in for the construction, which, by the way, Japan accomplished like that. And as you know, it was the first semiconductor factory of that stage, that normally in the world, it takes about 36 months to complete. Kumamoto was completed in 22 months. So that's a gold medal, for the Japanese. And I think, there will be at least 2 more prime ministers before the one in Arizona is going to be completed.
yes.
But all joking aside, I mean, you've got a forced regional development. Kumamoto makes a lot of sense because whether it is Sony Corporation or whether it's Toyota Corporation, as you know, Kitakyushu is a big industrial hub, and there are many willing customers. So my question to Koshiba-san is ultimately there's another development in the north, in Hokkaido, the Rapidus development. What are your thoughts of that? Because the end customers for the semiconductors are certainly not near Hokkaido. They're further away. How do you view that, that development?
Okay. First of all, certainly that, part construction of the Kumamoto TSMC was going well, and it was completed in 22 months. And, just mainly because of their general contractor has done a good job to secure the labor and also to keep all the construction on schedule. And but again, that one of the reasons why TSMC decided to go to Kumamoto is just because of the water,
Yeah.
so they can secure a lot of water, enough water for them to operate, not only Fab 1, also Fab 2, maybe possibly for the Fab 3.
Right.
Okay. So I think, for Rapidus, our general choice is to go to Hokkaido. That's where that we can get water and enough water for us to operate Fab 1, Fab 2. Actually, we call IIM, Fab 1, Fab 2, and possibly Fab 3. And also Hokkaido have now, place where we can get, eventually nuclear power to support a fab, the big mega fabs. So this Fab 1, of Rapidus is even bigger than the largest lab of, largest fab of TSMC. So I think, certainly that, semiconductor, operation requires a lot of resource, lot of utilities, water and power and others. So you have to remember, this semiconductor, in industry is, pretty much like a global, business. It doesn't cost you a lot for you to ship the, semiconductor chips, using air. So and also, Chitose is very close to Tokyo, right? So just only a little more than hour and 1 hour, you can go to Chitose, and the Rapidus just only 7 minutes away, from the airport. So logistically, I think it's a natural choice for us to choose that Chitose as a location.
And I think I failed to mention in my introduction that you are an outside director at Rapidus, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
Yes, yeah, exactly, right. Hence your very strong knowledge of what's going on. But that's a terrific story. Is that going to create a lot of jobs around Chitose? Is it already doing so? And do you?
Yeah, certainly that. Yeah, I think, certainly that it's creating a lot of jobs, but I think, before creating a lot of jobs, we're so much concerned about, the labor, whether we can secure enough labor or not. Not only a simple labor, but also that intelligence, to, run the fab. Fortunately, we get a lot of applications, here in Japan. Only for one job, we get something like 7 to 8 applications for one job. So far that start of the Rapidus has been so good, and also the leadership team of the Rapidus is doing a very good job to really keep everything on schedule right now.
Koshiba-san, let me pivot, a little bit away from semiconductors.
Sure.
You've done a lot of work in the Keizai Doyukai, and of course with Japanese politicians and with the Japanese regulators on the economic security promotion. And what is actually interesting is that, when initially 2 years ago, these economic security laws were put into place, global investors were very concerned that this would become an obstacle for increased participation, increased influence on corporate governance. And actually 2 years have passed, and basically I certainly have not met a single investor who's run into any obstacles because of economic security law. So that's something that's very positive. But I wanted you to elaborate on your second point that you made earlier about economic security promotion not being understood by domestic CEOs. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? What exactly do you mean?
Okay. So first of all, literally, this is a promotional law, right?
Yeah.
For us to revive or for us to secure a security, in a domestic, in a global society, our only choice is to grow economy. So for that, we created this promotion law, right? So they subsidize that, for supply chain.
Yeah.
Then also they subsidize that private sector and public sector collaboration for advanced, technologies. So this is not a nationalistic, law. As you can see from semiconductors, Japanese government subsidized a huge amount of money for TSMC, but also Micron, and also pouch semiconductors. So this is not very domestic, it's not very nationalistic, law. So, but suddenly after finishing this promotion law, we kind of start talking about security clearance, right? So for Japan to participate in an international coalition for, on advanced technologies, we need to really install security clearance, whoever involved in this sensitive international coalitions. So then now that when any company is helped by government for to develop some advanced technologies, there should be a guardrail, rail provisions like in the US, CHIPS and Act. If you get subsidy, you cannot invest in China for 10 years. Likewise, here in Japan, if you get the subsidy from the government, you really have to protect your outcomes. So now we are talking about R&D securities. So as you move the all the discussion forward, you see a little bit more like flavor over more like restrictions and regulatory nature, right? So then all the unless you understand the whole whole landscape of the economic security law, you pretty much misunderstand. This is more like a regulatory nature. So I think it's my job here at the Keizai Doyukai to really let people understand all the spirit of this promotion law and also other like security measures, so that we can really participate in a very valuable and a sensitive program to develop advanced technologies like semiconductors, quantum, bio.
Koshiba, in that vein, sorry, Bill. In that vein, could you obviously, apart from the CEOs and the business community and our friends in the national bureaucracy, you obviously deal with politicians. And do you mind? And I know you prefer to discuss politics over a glass of sake, so. But in all seriousness, in terms of the expertise and understanding from within the political class, in particularly within the LDP, I mean, do you think that they are adequately prepared, to have a meaningful discussion? What is your sense? Because obviously the landscape has changed quite a bit, and for a politician, it's very tempting to just jump on some nationalistic bandwagon. What's your assessment of the response in politics?
It's a little bit sensitive issue for me to answer, right? So certainly we get a lot of endorsement and a lot of commitment from political societies. But I'm not sure if they understand the whole holistic picture, right? They just work on semiconductors. They work on biologists. They work on quantum. Almost like a kind of silo, type approach. So they really have to understand that what you're gonna take you to security, national security. What's going to take you to green transformations? Those are the two most important, political initiatives, in Japan. So I just hoping they understand that the whole, holistic. They just keep a holistic view on those kind of national, the view on political agendas.
But it's interesting, Bill, right? Because remember how we used to talk about the iron triangle? Right?
Yes.
We talk about the LDP, we used to talk about, big business, and we used to talk about the bureaucracy. And Koshiba-san, this gives me my next question, there is obviously, when you talk about advanced technology, you talk immediately about science, about deep research, about collaboration between university deep research and industry. How, in your personal opinion, how is that new element, of the, what is that? Then it's no longer a triangle, it's I guess, a quadrat, as we say in German, right? How is the scientific community responding to this new focus on national security, national independence, etc.?
Yeah, I think really the biggest difference is that, as we say at the Doyukai, we say politics meets technology, right? Politics meets technology. So therefore, it used to be like politics here, technology is here, right? But it's not anymore, right? So if we invest a serious amount of money for science development, science research, it's a long-term thing. So it's very important, for two governments, US and Japan, they agree upon, some, diplomatic agenda. So for semiconductors, there is a bilateral agreement between Japan and the US. They, formulate some, task force. They develop, they review technologies. They also own that, the common roadmap for technology development. And we are now moving more into quantum technologies. But also with the UK, EU, we do have some science, programs. But the biggest difference is that politics, just endorses, those kind of, political, science programs. So that really makes, a lot of difference, in all times, in a good era of the global competitions, it's more kind of, given to private sector to, work together. But now that the private sector, but also public sector, they just endorse that common, programs.
And I mean, this helps. Perhaps I should just mention a question that's come in, while also encouraging anyone on the call to pose any questions that you might have in the Q&A function. Just write them in, and I'll pick them out. But an attendee from Sri Lanka, Dr. Jayasuriya, has asked. So we're a global global webinar. Has asked about how policy formation has focused in connection with the corporate law to boost directly investments in technology, which is, to me, a way that it links to your last answer, Koshiba-san, that it's all very well having a law about regulations, and you can have subsidies for certain factories and fabs and so forth. But what tools do you think, as a business person, have really proved effective in actually boosting real technological research over the long term, in connection either with economic security or with this general macro development? What's your advice on that?
I think, as a, business leaders, certainly that you like to invest, for the long term, goal, right? So therefore, once you do some development, serious R&D, it's going to take 5 or 6 years before you see some material results. So therefore, you won't invest somewhere, somewhere things would not change, somewhere, which would not be, affected by political games. So therefore, certainly that, now, all the governments, they're kind of talking about like quantum, AI, and bio for the future. Those are the 3 keywords, green technologies, computation technologies, and biotechnologies, So, those are the kind of 3 key, keywords, for any political government to endorse. So I think, being, corporate leaders, certainly we like to invest a lot of money, where that things will not change. So those kind of message from our governments, certainly helps us to, make bold decisions.
Bill,
Yeah.
if I may add on to this, and one thing that has fundamentally changed is that the startup ecosystem has really grown quite a lot. The government has fully embraced, this startup culture. Last year, you had about 4,500 startups being target companies by venture capital. Just in comparison, in the US last year, it was only about 7,500. Now the money scale is different, right? It's about 1/4 of the money, but still, coming from 5 years ago, 10 years ago, when it was less than 1,000 companies, seeing this change in the ecosystem, which is supported by the government. The government has created a lot of tailwinds. And the question now is that I think that you do have, for example, Matsuzoe-san, right? Japan's leading AI theoretician at Tokyo University, Professor Matsuzoe, right?
Matsuo-san.
Matsuo, is the leading AI person. He can stand his own against Sam Altman, all these people, right? And he's got this lab. Now, everyone on his lab, right, graduated to work for a startup. Not a single person is going to Hitachi or to Mitsubishi or any of the established companies, which again tells you, compared to the Japan that you and I got to know over the last 40 years, there's a new system, there's some new ecosystem, some new form of innovation. It's not coming out of Hitachi. It's not coming out of Komatsu. It's certainly not coming out of Toshiba, but there's a new plants are being seeded. And it will be interesting to see, and I wanted to ask you about this. In Japan, the large corporations primarily innovate internally. It's their internal R&D. It is not innovation by acquisition. So for example, if you look at a startup, in the United States, about 80% of the exit is through acquisition from a big company that basically uses the startup as their R&D laboratory. While in Japan, 80%, give or take, is IPO, and very, very few acquisitions actually happen. And we actually did some work. If you wanted to outperform the Japanese stock market, all you need to do is invest in those companies that have a track record of acquiring, of growing through acquisitions, rather than of companies that grow endogenously. You've outperformed basically, as you know, in the Japanese stock market now, the concentration is very, very high. 20 companies account for basically 90% of the performance of the Nikkei. And those companies are exactly the companies that have already embraced this development model of growing through acquisitions. Koshiba-san, do you think other Japanese CEOs will start to be able to embrace that new trend?
Yeah, I think, this is a good point. And, certainly that there is a kind of lot of push on startups. But here in Japan, most policies is toward the real startups. They should not forget about later stage startups. The one I'm pretty much like helping. They need, especially deep tech, later stage startups. There is no policy to support them.
Yeah.
So therefore, we're pretty much in the middle of, reviving or the kind of revising our government policies to, promote innovation. Here in Japan, that a lot of companies, they really want to do M&A. Whatever companies, whichever company they're visiting to, they are interested in strategic investment, including M&A. but they are pretty much, I would say like 80% of the companies I'm visiting, they are paying, more attention to the M&A in the US and Europe.
Yeah.
They are not really paying attention to the Japanese startups.
Yeah.
So I just want them to understand we do have excellent, deep tech startups in Japan. Yeah. But now that, as you say, certainly that, startup landscape in Japan is changing. But I would say we are a little bit 10 years behind the startup ecosystem in Europe, maybe like 20 years behind from the US.
And that maybe this is a good opportunity for me just to mention that you have a nonprofit called CDoS, which is advising a lot of startups, but also foreign companies, but in this deep tech area. And I hope you're advising them both to sell themselves to big Japanese companies, but also vice versa to improve this metabolism. But do you want to say a word about CDoS, just so that we understand?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for mentioning it. This CDoS is really meant for connecting dots. A friend of mine, myself, we kind of started this, we call think tank. We're pretty much looking at, all the corporate or national strategy through the lenses of geopolitics and capital market and advanced technologies. So we are, by nature, we are a think tank, but also at the same time, we just want to do something. So we're helping, national strategies, but also at the same time, we are helping Japanese startups to grow, but also at the same time, there are, quite a few, overseas companies, they want to come to Japan. So we are kind of connecting dots each other. So we are connecting startups to the large corporations, but also we are connecting the overseas startups that come to Japan. So that's what we are doing. But again, just avoid any conflict of common interest. We're just keeping our nature of the non-profit organization.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. And connects a little bit, but perhaps also with your Keizai Doyukai work, to a question that Christina Davis has put in, she is professor of Japanese politics at Harvard University. She says, thanks for a fascinating discussion. Do you think Japan is doing enough to establish export controls and inward investment screening to protect emerging technology with dual use applications? How does it compare to the UK and the US? How do you both see that?
Yeah. So I'm sitting in the expert committees or expert councils of the most of the, I would say, all national security related government councils. Always what we do is to just benchmark our system with the UK and the US. So nothing more or nothing less. So we really have to meet our international standards. So still we are in the middle of implementing new all the new measures for us to be international to become international partners for alliance countries, also like-minded countries, US and UK. So we are pretty much in the process of developing a whole system right now. So right. Yeah, we see that how it goes. So but also at the same time, certainly in speaking of a national economy, national economic securities, 80% is toward, unfriendly countries, but also 20% is toward US.
Right.
But I can talk about it, right?
I think Koshiba-san makes the very, very important point, and he's obviously in the thick of it. Again, the whole model, right, has to change. And that's exactly what Japan is doing. And it's doing it very, very methodologically. I can give you one specific example, and this idea of what is a secret and what is not a secret, what is a national secret and what is a private secret, which goes also ultimately into intellectual property protection. where Japan has been very weak, from an international perspective. But I will give you a positive example. As you may know, Japan produces, probably the best, diesel electric submarines in the world. And this actually is a joint venture with a Swedish company. And the reports from the Swedish company are spectacularly good in the sense of that, guess what? The Japanese can actually keep a secret. So, but it's interesting, right? This is just one example. And again, I think the point, many of us, like Bill, like myself, we've been looking at Japan, or we've had the fortune of looking at Japan over the last 30, 40 years. And there was a very specific model of development, a very specific model of innovation, a very specific model of social economic policy. This is now being revamped. And the ishiki, the focus of the mind, is obviously moving at different speeds. But, this is the exciting part about Japan. I think what I'm really trying to say is that we all, as Japan observers, will have to reinvent ourselves, because the way A moves to B to C to D, and what are the incentives, that is all beginning to change very, very interesting. And that's this metabolism that makes Japan very exciting, at this particular juncture.
And this, I mean, just let me mention, there's another question about how to improve productivity. That's part of all of the issue about metabolism. You talked about M&A, you talked about we're moving things from A to B, really, technology, capital investment, better management. That's going to be a key thing for us to follow in the future. You've pointed out that we really perhaps haven't spent enough time on the yen yet in this, which is the way in which we evaluate how well Japan is doing. The value of what Japan is doing as it revamps itself is declining on world markets, seemingly. Is your prediction a 190 to the dollar now?
No, my prediction stays the same as it has been for the last 12 months. It's 200, 220. I'm not joking. And I think, now, when you look at Japan's balance of payments, you actually see two fundamental changes. And the first change is that Japan's export sensitivity to the world economy has effectively collapsed. You find that despite the yen being at 155, 160, right, Japanese exports are incredibly weak. And the reason for this is substitution from made in China now being perfectly competitive. Even some of the leading companies like Fanuc, the robotics giant, Murata Seisakusho, right? You see their international orders in the first 6 months of this year down 20, 25%. This is very weak. I mean, the world economy is not at its best, but it's not at its worst either, right? So it's quite interesting. And it's the substitution, because made in China robots, made in China, components are now perfectly competitive, and that's a structural weakness that Japan is going to have to contend with. The second structural weakness is what is now termed the digital deficit, which is that when you look at the balance of payments corporate services account, right, you basically find that corporate services in the international balance of payments were more or less sometimes in balance, sometimes a little bit surplus, sometimes a bit negative. Over the last 4 or 5 years, it has crept up to a deficit of more than 1.2% of GDP. It's a straight line going down. And that is, of course, because of DX. Everybody is moving to the cloud, but the only people providing cloud services are the Americans, AWS, Microsoft, etc. And so from a balance of payments perspective, despite all this good stuff that we've talked about, the corporate metabolism, etc., if you look at the international balance of payments, the equilibrium value of the yen has depreciated. It is not what people call, people do purchasing power parity calculations. They say, oh, a Big Mac, in Los Angeles and a Big Mac in Tokyo, when is it the same? At about 110, 115, right? this is no longer correct in my opinion, because there are some structural challenges, because the competition, number one, from the People's Republic of China is real across the capital goods, the machinery, machine tool sector. And number two, the digital deficit is going to take a long time to address for Japanese service provider like NTT Data, like Fujitsu, to actually have cloud services that are onshore, that are competitive with the American giants.
Well,
let me say a
last
little bit
word
about
to you,
this.
Koshiba.
Yeah, this digital deficit, I highlighted like 2 or 3 years ago to my government. Certainly that, as you mentioned, this service deficit is so high, something like a 5.8 trillion yen in Japan, right?
Yep.
So, but also the problem is that the growth of the digital deficit is going to grow, it's going to be something like a 40% per year. This according to Moore's law, right?
Yep.
So what we are doing right now, certainly, here in Japan, we just want to, leverage the power of the computation provided by AWS or Azure, certainly that, US vendors. But also at the same time, Japanese government is subsidizing, many companies to create their own, language model.
Yeah.
But also, Japanese government is subsidizing RIKEN, which is our national science lab in Japan, to hybridize quantum and fugaku in Japan. So certainly that we are kind of late for AI or conventional semiconductor market. But what we are trying to do, being aware of this, digital deficit issue, we are now investing into the next generation, computation technology, so that we can, make up. I don't know whether we can recover all the deficits, but at least we really have to, develop the world best, computation technology here in Japan too.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, thank you both very much. That's been a terrific discussion. We've run out of time, sadly, but I thank you, Mitsunobu Koshiba, and of course, as always, Jesper Koll, for joining us, for stimulating us in enormous ways. We've covered an enormous territory, particularly in all that technology and economic security area. And that this last digital discussion has given us a lot to watch, really, in terms of how the progress of that is going to happen. So thank you. Thank you to everyone who's joined us from Asia Society Tokyo and from the Japan Society. And we look forward we wish you an excellent summer. And we will look forward to seeing you at the next quarterly Japan Macro Salon and keeping in touch with you, Koshiba-san. I hope very much. Thank you to you all and have a great day.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
どうも、さよなら。
さようなら。